Hello, everyone. This is Chen, your good friend. Welcome to Fazuher again. I'm just for those new listeners. This is Chen. I'm based in Austin, Texas. I'm the cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. And today, with me to continue our discussion about Hegel's The Science of Logic is my dear friend Aran. How are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing good, Trent. This is Oran for the ones who are joining us from this episode. Welcome. I am also based in Austin. I teach philosophy here and work on German philosophy for the most part, but also interested in how the tradition of German idealism gets connected to the questions that we have in the 21st century in political and social contexts.
Right. For those of you who have been following our channel so far, will probably have noticed that there has been a 2 month hiatus in our release, which I assure you is not like we're trying to say farewell to you. It's just that after being thoroughly frustrated while reading Hegel's text, it's rather because the very nature of the way we turn our discussion, reading, and debate into a um, publicly accessible format, namely through our podcast series. So here's the rhythm we'll have. Aaron and I have discussed this for a few times, and we think it will be very helpful for you to be aware so that you can like allocate your time accordingly, as that we'll likely to release the several episodes um, in after an interval of digestion and comparison. So for the period between our most recent episode and the current one has been 2 months because we have been trying to reevaluate the direction to go and stuff like that. So rest assured, we're still trying to find the right rhythm, but for the moment, we think 2 months is a good interval, and at the end of such an interval, you will likely find 3 or 4 episodes out on stuff we have been examining and tinkering over. And for this one and the coming one will still be on Hegel's Science of Logic, but afterwards we may take a pause and switch to like other texts with regard to what the question that is very centered to our project is what does it mean to be human? What's the relationship between universal and individual, and the relationship between, say, culture and society? So that's a first item of our general announcement. Do you have anything to like supplement, or you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to talk about it. Yeah, so as Trent said, we have these conversations and we take the time to read and discuss. And I think it is good to also mention this point, which is related to the second point that we wanted to announce here, is to like what are we trying to do? Like what type of a conversation are you listening to, right? And we have talked about this in the very beginning in our manifesto that the world is filled with just 15-minute videos on some sophisticated topic, just watering it down to a point that is just nonsense, or hyper focused academic work that they take for granted very basic things about what they are investigating. And they get into this kind of a technical discussion that might go deep in that dimension, but not in the dimension of, okay, what is this text telling us about some more, great questions that we have been talking about in human history. The nature of our conversations is that, number one, to be very blunt, we do not want to bullshit you. So one of the reasons that we had this like delay was that we wanted to be the stage that we can meaningfully talk about what Hegel is talking about in Science of Logic. Not that we fully understand or we fully agree, but now we have found a way to present what we think is going on in a rather articulate way, a way that is not just filled with random jargon, but we think we know the pulse. We know what is how things are moving, and at least what type of arguments Hegel has for what he is doing, and what kind of a defense Houlgate has about what Hegel is doing. This also implies that you're not listening to lectures. We're not co-lecturing on the science of logic. That just means that you are gonna hear us acknowledging that we think that we made a mistake, and now this is what is happening. So this is a dialectical nature of our conversations. They're ever evolving, and they are responsive to our new readings, new findings, new conversations, and your contribution, which is the part that Trent is gonna tell us more. But as we said from the very beginning, we are looking for more expansive conversation, a dimension in the world of conversation, intellectual conversation, that we think it's absence. And that's why we take you seriously. Trent, do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, thanks a lot for highlighting the dialectic nature of our conversation, though, from which the final output, the videos, spring. And dialectic does not just mean it's in introspective, that the two of us, or maybe our friends, within our immediate circle, revisit our past analysis and perhaps mistakes, so that's to get to a new stage. But it also means taking your comments, your input, especially the critical and the constructive ones, very seriously. So Arunava discussed and decided that in order to do justice to the thought and time some of you very generously shared with this channel in producing really elaborate and helpful comments, we'll make such so-called response videos to address them carefully and allocate sufficient time so that other people may chime in and share your thought about this conversation, so that this channel we're trying above all to construct, as we said in our manifesto, a platform so that people could share their thoughts with regard to such important and inspiring topics, I would say. So from time to time, together with the more so-called text-oriented episodes, we will also blend it with a certain response episode to the existing comments. So for those of you who have already left such comment, thank you very much. And we are not ignoring them. We're just taking time to digest and hopefully come up with a meaningful and good faith response so that we can continue and deepen this conversation. So you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. So that means that keep commenting, right? The more substantial your comment is, critical or otherwise, it makes us very much we're already very invested in doing this. It makes it even more. And like, you can also envision the possibility of like turning this into a more, expansive conversations in all directions. That image is exciting for us, and it is hopefully exciting for you too. The last thing that I want to mention here for people who have been following us and listening to our episode, especially on Hegel's logic, what has happened is that we have discussed Hegel's science of logic, the beginning of Hegel's science of logic, and we've used Houlgate's interpretation of Hegel's science of logic to kind of guide us in understanding text, and it has been tremendously important and helpful for us. However, as we're progressing through the text and Houlgate's interpretation and Stephen Houlgate's lectures on science of logic, which you can find on YouTube as well, disagreements are emerging. And we have talked with Trent of how to manage this and still be kind of articulate and keep the flow, but also raise our concerns. So what is going to happen is that what you're going to hear is at this stage, the next few episodes, is going to be our understanding of what Hegel is saying, mainly, primarily based on Hegel's interpretation. That doesn't mean that every point that we raise is directly from Houlgate's interpretation, but it is, I think, fair to say that the points that we're going to make in these couple of videos before getting to our concerns are something that Houlgate will agree with, to a very good degree. At least that's our, from what our understanding. This is not, fundamentally diverging from his interpretation. Now, after we do this and we have this kind of a flow in place, then there is room for raising our concerns about Houlgate's interpretation specifically, but also Hegel's project as well. So for now, let's get back to the text. Let's start with a summary of what we have done. Let's expand, and then there will be time for criticism of Houlgate's interpretation and Hegel's text as well. Trent, are we good to go?
Yes, let's go. Thanks very much for deciding on the issue. We should make such a general announcement before continuing this discussion. But for our listeners, would you please recap the essentials of our project so far, and so that we can have background or context about the specific
Yeah.
topics.
So in the broader context of what we have been talking about, as you mentioned, we have talked about enlightenment, counter-enlightenment. We have talked about Rose's book and Hegel contra sociology. We have started talking about Hegel's science of logic. What is important in all of these approaches is realizing that when, for instance, we think about the debate between enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, that reemerges in many new shapes in different platforms and different disciplines. And there are some very basic points that are matter of debate. And sometimes these points are directly addressed as, question of being, human nature. Like, what is the human nature? But human nature itself could be parsed out and kind of distinguished further into its constituting parts. And in doing that, one of the main things that has come to our attention is the relation between universals and particulars, universal and individuals. That type of a relationship, right? Now, going there, reaching that stage that this is a fundamental problem that finds itself in politics, history, religion, sociology, all of those areas of life and knowledge. We ended up talking about Hegel's logic. Number one, because we thought that he is holding a very strange space in this intellectual space, in the intellectual world, right? He's definitely influenced by Enlightenment thinking, right? It is undeniable that he's part of that project in many ways, but he's very critical of very basic figures of Enlightenment in its different formats. Scottish Enlightenment, but mainly the continental Enlightenment, continental side of Enlightenment, championed by Kant, right? So he has that kind of a critical approach. We have already talked about people who are critical of Enlightenment, Hamann, Herder, Vico, but Hegel doesn't seem to fit what they are criticizing. Maybe more so with Herder and Vico sometimes, but definitely not the way that Hamann is critical of Enlightenment, right? And because of that strange place, we are interested in. But there is another thing that makes us interested, which is what is happening in Hegel's science of logic, which Hegel fits this tremendous project of re-examining very basic concepts that we seem to just be taking for granted. Now, Hegel does not start his project by saying that, hey, you know, we have the concept of infinity. Let me just go re-examine that. He has a very peculiar way of going about this. But the result of it is that at least he redirects our attention to those very basic concepts. Okay. Now, the way this project starts is to ask one specific question. What is it to be? Now, we can get to this question through thinking about thinking, right? And saying that, okay, what is the relationship between thinking and being? And then proceeding to say that, okay, if you don't want to assume anything random about the relationship between the two, about thinking and being, the only thing that we can say about thinking is that thinking is. But then we are back to the same question. What is it to say that something is? Or in a more Hegelian way of articulating this, what is it to be? Now, the starting point for Hegel in answering this question, because of his insistence on not presupposing anything unnecessary about what is it to be, is to start with something that is the most unsophisticated understanding of being. If you start the answer to question of what is it to be to say that, oh, being means, you know, being part of nature, or like having this specific internal structure, or having this or that relationship with our perceptual, you know, apparatus. Too many sophistication, too many questions, too many things for us to be skeptic about, right? And Hegel wants to say that let's not assume those, right? Let's not assume any of those things. And let's get to a place that we don't need any sophisticated account of being, right? What is it to be has a very simple answer. Let's start there and then see what happens. And the way that Hegel articulates this very basic point, very basic simplicity of answering the question of what is it to be, is to imply the idea of pure immediacy. That basically means that to be doesn't need any further conceptualization. We can say it is just in the presence of it, right? In it. It's like, that's it. It's immediate. There is no, you know, like system of categories that we need to have in place to, you know, grasp being. Being is just being. It's just there. It's there and just in it, and the difference between us and being is not even, you know, really articulated. And from this very, you could say, naive view of being, or you could say very, you know, an attempt to grasp all the richness of being, depending on how you approach this, we can then see, you know, if this works. And the idea throughout the book is the idea of immanence, meaning that we shouldn't start criticizing pure immediacy by saying that, oh, you know, but pure immediacy is not enough to make sense of, you know, trees, you know, because there's always a possibility of someone showing up and saying that, no, those are all overcomplications. Like, you don't need any of those concepts. We don't need any of those distinctions. All of these distinctions start to evaporate when you really think about being, right? When you get in touch with being, all of these differentiations between different objects becomes artificial and unnecessary, right? So the way to proceed for Hegel is not this kind of external criticism, it's an internal criticism, which basically means that this account and any other account that shows up in the Hegel science of logic should collapse on its own terms. Like, it should, for some reason or the other, not work without any reference to anything external to itself. That's a claim, right? And me and Shen have a problem with that claim. That we will articulate that problem later on, but that's the problem, right? That's the idea, and the problem with it is gonna discuss later on. Now, in this kind of a progress that Hegel has in mind, that by the way cannot be predicted, we cannot say that, oh, we already know period immediacy is not going to work. And we already know what is the last, stage. Let's talk about the progress. No, like if you take Hegel's science of logic seriously, right? Think about it like the way, like, Charles Dickens uh, published some of his work, right? It was like a weekly way of publishing, right? It was just weekly, it was just like something will pop up, right? It's the same with Hegel's science of logic. You don't know when this ends. Maybe it ends next week, right? The fact that we have the whole book in front of us shouldn't be anything of relevance, right? Because we just get the first part in the mail, and if this makes sense, this makes sense. Let's finish it, right? Because of that, because of this emphasis on imminence and this kind of uncertainty of predicting where things go, there is no real way to talk about method as something that's just applied at every stage. The only method, quote unquote method, is that change must come as a result of internal collapse of a conception of being. Our first conception of being is pure immediacy. Like, if we take pure immediacy really seriously, does it hold? And there is, I think, no universal answer to what does it mean to something for some concept to hold, because I think that is also evolving throughout the project. So this is the basic summary of what is happening. Trent, do you have anything to add to this summary?
No, I think we have talked enough about this, and this what we done has been a recapitulation of the first episodes on the whole series. So shall we just press on and then go into our
Yeah,
next?
let's do it. Let's do did you do the movement? Like, this is also like a little bit of a summary, but after this brief point, which is from the text itself, we enter a stage of the dialectic that we haven't talked about. So being pure immediacy pops up. Now our question is, or anyone who is taking Hegel's project seriously, the question is, why this cannot be a sufficient answer to the question of what is it to be, right? Why can we say that it's pure immediacy? All this just sophistication and complexities are, just artificial, and yeah, that's it. We don't have anything else. We don't need to add anything else, right? Now, there is here one of the main sources of disagreement or question happens here about like this move, this very basic first move. We are gonna have problems with what Houlgate says, but here we present what Houlgate says. And this is, by the way, different from what we have presented before in our conversations, because there we were thinking more about what we think. And after listening to Houlgate and reading more, it is clear that he's not thinking the way that we are thinking. So Houlgate's point is that, look, pure immediacy is so indeterminate that it's just in fact nothing at all. Like, idea of pure immediacy is just lacks so, like, I don't want to use the word border, but it feels that way, that it just kind of evaporates. It feels like a gas that doesn't have any sort of a container. It just like dissipates and disappears. Like, it doesn't have anything to hold it, glue it. There's no internal glue to this conception of being. So in that sense, there's no difference between this and talking about just like nothing. There's no difference between being and nothing, right? Or being ends up being nothing. That's the more accurate way of talking about it. Being ends up being just actually nothing. The trick here, however, is that when we say that, okay, we started from being, we thought being is pure immediacy, but then we pondered, we're like, pure immediacy is just so indeterminate, is actually nothing, right? It's not being, right? Maybe we're still making some sort of an affirmative claim about nothing, right? We're saying like nothing is. We are making an affirmative point about nothing. But the only conception of what we have about affirmativeness is what we already had in pure being, right? So we started from pure being, pure immediacy as being. We realize it's just so indeterminate, it just evaporates. It's actually nothing. It's not being. But nothing still is. And if nothing still is, oh, something is. That's called nothing. We're back to being. Being is pure immediacy, right? But again, pure immediacy doesn't hold, doesn't have any glue, dissipates. It's nothing. But hey, we say it's nothing, that it means that we are affirming that it is something we call nothing. So we're back to the claim being. But being, we have established so far that it's nothing but pure immediacy, and so on, right? So then there is this kind of a circle of movement between being to nothing, nothing to being, being to nothing, nothing to being, right? Hegel calls this becoming. The constant movement of vanishing, being vanishing into nothing, nothing vanishing into being, because both seem to imply one another. This is the move from being to becoming, right? Before entering the territory of becoming and seeing why Hegel and Houlgate think that becoming is not a stable way of understanding being. Trent, anything here?
Yes, you sounded just like a broken record for the past 2 minutes, like being moves to nothing, never spoke to being. I think that's a very faithful representation of how Houlgate carries his students from the stage to the next. Yes, it is constant. The only thing I'll probably emphasize here is the two never coexist. When never being, say, as by virtue of being pure immediacy, dissipates, as you put it elegantly, it vanishes into nothing. So in becoming nothing is no longer pure immediacy in that sense. And so the two are constantly switching into each other and never coexist, which will differ very differently, will differ greatly from our next stage of this dialectic, the positive, the affirmative, and negative element of being, basically. Yes.
Yeah, and bear in mind that here, what we have discussed, a couple of things that we have discussed before, they are gonna re-emerge in like our statement of the problems with this interpretation. The point about determinacy is important here, right? And that we suddenly start talking about determinacy, and it seems like that pure immediacy being indeterminate is a problem, and that moves the dialectic, quote unquote. And also think about memory that we also have talked about. That who is keeping the score? And that is going to be an interesting point in our relation with this text, because there is a locus of memory in all of this process that it is not explicitly discussed by Houlgate. And we think that is important, that who is keeping the score in this dialectical process is important. But returning to the text and entering a stage that we haven't talked about, we need to talk about the transition from becoming to determinate being, right? And here, I think this quotation from Houlgate is very important, and I will read it, and then we can unpack what is going on. Houlgate writes, quote, "Being and nothing can each be said to vanish into each other only insofar as it is absolutely different from that other. But in vanishing into its other, each proves that it is not different from that other after all." Right? So the point here that is another recurring theme throughout the book that we find very interesting and we still try to grapple with is the concept of difference. Because difference when you think about difference, it seems like that we have like a very commonsensical understanding of difference. The two things are different when they're not, I don't know, the same, right? But difference in Hegel's logic takes many different shapes, right? Now we have the first version of this difference that actually proves to be non-existent, and that's absolute difference, right? The argument that is presented here is that, okay, being and nothing are absolutely different, right? Being is being, nothing is nothing. There's no reason why we think they have any connection. We started with being, it evaporated, it's nothing. And nothing is, oh, so it's being again. Oh, being, just vanishes, nothing, right? But the fact that this vanishing happens, right, contradicts the initial stance that these two are absolutely different. Whatever the difference between being and nothing is, right, in this original presentation, that difference cannot be absolute. Okay. And I want to read you the formulation that we have for this,
Right,
that is going to reemerge in our criticism, right? That it seems like that the way that this is functioning, the way that this move is being presented to us, is that Hegel and Houlgate are suggesting that if concept or entity one, it's hard to name, being and nothing, whatever, however you want to approach it, right? If concept entity number one ends up being concept entity number two, then there is no absolute difference between the two, right? Otherwise, we cannot make this move, right? So the point that Houlgate is trying to make is that, and I think that's true to what Hegel is saying, is that, okay, like we have being was being, nothing was nothing. Being turned into nothing, nothing turned into being, this becoming happened, this vanishing. But hey, if these two things are vanishing into one another, right, they cannot be absolutely different, right? Two things that could end up being each other, and the fact that they could end up being each other, that just means they're not absolutely different, right? And I mean, very just like, anyone who has grappled with Hegel's science of logic knows the desperate thirst for concrete examples and the utter disappointment of any coming with any such concrete examples. So what an example that I give is not relevant to this stage, but it is something that I think similar to what is happening. Like if you have gold and you have solid gold and you melt it and you add it to something else, and now you have something that does not resemble gold at all. It's just something that seems like absolutely different, right? Insofar as that thing is related to the first one, because it is like there was a transition, but that transition there was a path there. That just means that this production number one, the gold, and production number two, whatever you want to call it, the melted version, is not there. They cannot be absolutely different because there was a transition from one to the other, right? If there is vanishing from one to the other, there cannot be absolute difference. That's, I think, the argument, right? And by the way, for those of you who are not reading the text itself, you cannot believe how short these passages are. It's just absurdly short, and terse and concise, if you want to put it positively. But like this happens very fast. But I think we have gotten the logic of it, of why Hegel now wants to move out, or why the dialectical process cannot stay at the level of becoming, because becoming's presupposition is that being and nothing are absolutely different, but becoming's point is that they're vanishing into one another. These two contradict, therefore, being and nothing are not absolutely different. Becoming cannot be true.
right. Yes, that's exactly what we have been making sense of, that very absurdly swift move, as you said. So if becoming, as we stated, that cannot be true, and this is a very precarious, a little unstable transition between being and nothing, it's not helpful to understand the concept of being. What should be the next step then?
Yeah, so now that we have understood, right, that being and nothing, insofar as they vanish into one another, prove that they're not absolutely different, there is only one way to think about this now, that being and nothing are not absolutely different. If they're not absolutely different, at what level they are connected, right? There is a relationship between them, that it's not like that being is from one universe and nothing is from another universe. No, they're part of the same universe, right? And because they are the only characters that we have so far, right? That's the whole quote unquote universe that we have, right? In that sense, we can think of being and nothing as two sides of the same coin, right? They're different, like two sides of a coin are different. They could be very different in like how they present themselves, but they're part of the same coin, right? That has been the realization so far. And that quote unquote coin is called Dasein, or determinate being, right? And now it's like the language of determinacy, at least in the English version, is coming into play. What has changed here, which is gonna be a fascinating like theme, is that we have understood that there is no being without non-being, right? There is some purely affirmative being is incoherent. And maybe as a consequence, we can say pure affirmation is just absurd, right? Any affirmation requires negation. Or in a more Hegelian sense, being includes non-being. So Hegel here, from the text, Houlgate's translation, tells us that when he is talking about like the determinate being or Dasein, he's not thinking, let me read the code and decipher it later. He says, Hegel says, being is not the universal, determinateness, not the particular. Determinateness has not yet severed itself from being, and indeed it will no more sever itself from being. For the truth, which from now on underlies them as ground, is the unity of non-being with being. On this as ground, all further determinations are developed. And boy, you won't believe how this sentence is true. Because as you are going to see, this whole idea of what is it to say that non-being is attached to being is going to keep coming back in ways that you cannot even imagine. Just this negation, like what does it mean to say that affirmation cannot exist without negation, right? Being Hegel he's saying it's not that it is universal and like, you know, we pick one side of it and we call that like, you know, this is the particular side of it. And that's, you know, that's the determined being. No, being itself is not coherent, is incoherent without invoking non-being, right? Now, like what the process is going to be from now on is how these things, how these two, like being and non-being, in fact, are interconnected, right? There is one point that Houlgate mentions here that I want to talk about, and then Trent, if you have something to add about these last two episodes, not last two episodes, but last two slides, you can chime in. But in 311, because we wondered, right? Like when we were talking with Trent about like what does it mean to say being and non-being are kind of intertwined? And I think a very immediate way to understand this, and I think initially we understood it this way, is that okay, something is only in contrast with something that it is not, right? A book is a book insofar as it is not, or it is not its opposite, like not its contrasting space that includes everything else, right? These two must happen at the same time, right? Which is, I think, is a rather, straightforward interpretation of what Hegel says. And what Houlgate tell us in 311 and 311 of Opening of Hegel's Logic, in some ways, confirms this. Houlgate writes, if Hegel is right, however, we only understand what red really is by noting what distinguishes it from green, yellow, and so on. You have to draw such distinctions because we can understand there is to be anything determinate at all only by differentiating what is before us from what it is not. This does not mean that we have to establish the way in which a thing differs from everything else before we can identify it at all. A thing is thought to be determinate the moment it is distinguished from anything that it is not. Having said this, it is, of course, true that our understanding of the determinacy of something grows the more we recognize how it differs from other things. So it seems like that Houlgate is saying what we just said, in the sense that, saying that being and non-being are intertwined is to say that we can only make sense of the affirmative presence of something, red, fair, book, whatever, only if we have this other space that is not that thing, right? Otherwise, there is no meaning of talking about this, talking about any object. And of course, we're not talking about objects, we're talking about being at this higher level, but, same logic applies there. Matter of contrast with an other. Fascinating thing, though, is that that is not the initial move that you're going to see. The initial move is not going to be, oh, this is the matter of concept and contrast between something and other. There is a very different understanding of what the moment of non-being really means that precedes the contrast with an other. We're going to talk about that in more details next time, of course. And there's one point that we want to add before ending this episode. But before going there,
Right.
Grant, do you have anything to add here?
Yes, only one thing I think that really stood out to me while revisiting this passage or whatever is the whole so-called dialectic method, which, as you had made very clear in the beginning of the previous episode, is not a predetermined method which has already taken into the whole enterprise as grounded or solid, but rather as you compared quite ingeniously with Dickens, the serialization of a fiction that if there's a financial problem with the press, you might not receive the ending of the story, stuff of that order. Yes, it's that dialectic method. I think I started to appreciate there as kind of source or fountain of its momentum. We put it in engineer term, probably it's a motor or it's an engine. I think it's precisely that negating impulse, that the non-being and the being, they're constantly wrestling with each other, or not, or being and constantly wrestling with each other, and that negating process pushes the whole enterprise to the next level. I think that is what I start to see with more clarity after revisiting such a passage. That if you can go back to the from becoming to determinate being, that slide, yes. The being and the determinants that are not in a relationship like a universal and a particular, but they accompany each other in a not separable way, so that the whole process is not for one moment in station and for next moment in motion, but they're constantly moving. As we said, the dialectic, like the whole as a category is purged with the absolute claim of absolute or purity, we feel the whole enterprise has been in motion or is moving. That motion, I think, is, if anything, unites or stages of self-criticism, that negative, that unleashing negative impulse. I think it's very close to this the core of this sentence, that their relationship is not universal and particular, but rather they are not separable. Yes, that's something that came to mind when we revisited this passage for me.
Yes, and this theme that, you know, being and nothing are like on the same terrain, right? And being cannot be separated from the negative. In some ways, from now on, with kind of understanding that point, understanding meaning to at least appreciate what is, you know, proposed here.
Right.
It's gonna make things a little bit easier. That implications of this, like, think about it this way: implications of saying that the negative must be with the affirmative is not yet understood. We don't know what that means,
Right.
right? And what we do is to continuously try to understand what that means. And what we, you know, maybe more commonsensically think of this, that this is about something being not an other, it's only one implications of unleashing negativity. It's one way to explicate what it means to be the negative, right? What it means to say that the affirmative always have the negative, right? And that is going to become very important later on. Now, what we want to end this episode with is this rather strange move that in our discussions that we had with Tren, we really didn't understand why suddenly this happened, but it's not that important. That's the introduction of the concept of quality, right? Suddenly we are faced with this point that determinate being is basically just quality. There just seems to be no real fundamental difference. And Houlgate writes, quote, quality is utterly inseparable from determinate being. One might say that it is what determinate being is. Indeed, as Harris puts it, it is nothing but the latter's what. If one takes away quality, one takes away determinate being itself. Now, Hegel calls quality determinacy that is, Sein der Bestimmtheit. And, you know, we can think about this affirmative determinacy. I don't think there is, at least at this level, not clear to us that if there is anything important about this move, other than just saying that, okay, determined being is just a quality. And the way that we, in our conversation, try to envision this of like what it means to say quality, it is of course clear that Hegel is not talking about quality of a something, right? He's talking about quality as such. And quality as such is what determining being is. And the parallel, again, all of these examples are flawed, but hopefully helpful, was the concept of vibe, right? When you enter a place and there is a vibe, that vibe is not just about the quality of one specific object or one specific person or one specific color or one specific like drink. It's about the whole thing has something that is called vibe. Now, take this to the extreme. Quality seems to be the vibe of being, vibe of determinate being, what it is. Right? Now, the only thing here that becomes very important is that once we transfer this, you know, the determinate being to quality, what happens is that now we have two moments present at the same time. With thinking of quality as affirmative determinacy, we have the accent of affirmative determinacy. It is something. It is, you know, there is that point about being there. So affirmative determinacy refers to the being side of quality, which Hegel calls reality. And affirmative determinacy, the accent on determinacy, emphasizes on the non-being side of quality, which Hegel calls negation. 2 points. Number one, here when we're thinking about reality and negation, we're going to talk about their relationship in a second, but we're not fools anymore. we know that there is no pure affirmation, there is no pure negation, sort of, right? We have at least gotten away from the very absolute version of this in being a nothing. So we kind of know really reality and negation are intertwined. We don't know what that means, right? We don't know really what that implies, right? And our story, the story that we're going to tell you is going to include finding ways to express what that relationship actually is. And the second thing and the last thing I'm going to say, and it's on Utran, and then we can end this, is this association between determinacy and negation, right? That still, I'm not sure why we're thinking about determinacy as the part about negation only, right? Why negation is responsible for determinacy? Because remember, we switch to determinate being as soon as we realize that being has a negation in it, right? And we're just like, okay, this is determinate. Now, one way to look at it is that whole point about, red as opposed red not being yellow, not being blue, not being so and so, right? That okay, it gets determined more and more. The more we know what something is not, the more determined it becomes. Sure, but it also becomes what it is because of other reasons. Like the determinacy in the sense of contrasting something with others doesn't seem absolutely satisfactory to me. But that's something that we can raise and talk about more later on. But what is important is that now, from being as pure immediacy, from the bare idea of being, now we're in determinate being as quality, which has moments of reality of negation that are somehow interconnected, that we don't really know what that interconnection is, and we don't really know what negation actually means. And that's how this story is gonna unfold.
Yes, I'll just quickly say one thing before ending this episode is you mentioned that I'm 100% with you in the sense that at this stage it's not clear to us why it's important to define determinate being as a quality by introducing a new term. But one way, I think it's also emphasized in Houlgate's lecture series on Hegel's logic, is that his whole project is not just to answer this question, but also in so doing, providing a dictionary for philosophical inquiry. So the project burdened itself with the task of deriving the important central terms, which are not so alien to pre-existing philosophical achievements. So here, quality is like central to, say, classical logic or into Kant's project. And Hegel is trying to say, wait, like you cannot arrive at quality just by assumption, but instead you have to derive it. As we will see in the coming episode with the concept of something, that it is important to connect Hegel's project with his philosophical tradition, as he's perfectly aware of how important the historical individual is limited and enabled by his or her culture as well as history. So I think to a certain extent, maybe we can definitely revisit this in after perhaps finishing the doctrine of being, whatever. See what kind of important vocabularies are derived and whether they are truly useful at that particular stage, or Hegel's kind of preemptorily introducing it just for the sake of using his stuff as a manual of reference for philosophers to be. Yes, that's my comment on this.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point, both in the context of history of philosophy and in the context of deriving the concepts. And there are, as we have seen so far, like reasons for talking in a certain way becomes clearer when we get to the next stage and we look back and we're just like, this is like how like the whole thing is being like mapped out, and now it makes sense of like suddenly talking about quality, like making that move, like that transition becomes more relevant later on. Great. I think we're good with this episode. Let's just finish it up and delve into the next weird thing from
Yes. So thanks for listening, dear listeners. Stay tuned. Something is coming up.